Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. This episode is being released in December 2021, 80 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States of America into the Second World War. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, just before 8 a.m. in the morning, the Japanese launched their attack on the US naval base of Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii. The attack was planned as a first strike to cripple the US fleet in the Pacific and prevent America from intervening in other Japanese Pacific operations. From 6 Imperial Japanese Aircraft carriers, over 350 planes flying in 2 waves attacked Pearl Harbor. 8 US Navy battleships will be damaged, 4 sunk, along with other cruisers and destroyers. But one element of the US Pacific Fleet escaped this preemptive strike. The Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were all absent from Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack. Roosevelt would proclaim the 7th of December 1941 as a date that would live in infamy. Joining me to discuss the attack on Pearl Harbor is Mark Stilley. Mark is a naval historian who is prolific in his studies on the naval war in the Pacific. He's written Tora, Pearl Harbor 1941 from Osprey, and has 2 new books out looking at the whole of the US naval campaign in the Pacific, the United States Navy in World War II from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, and Pacific Carrier War, carrier combat from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa. Now, this podcast is brought to you with the kind contributions of fellow listeners. If you think there is a vast machine at work in the background with assistants, researchers and audio engineers all beavering away, paid for by a philanthropic millionaire, you would be wrong. It's just me. But I could use your help. It all costs me, and it's not just my time. Software, research material is all an ongoing cost. But how can I help, I hear you cry? Well, if each one of you tossed a shekel in my virtual tip jar at patreon.com/WW2podcast, I would have a pretty good monthly salary. But I appreciate not everyone has the luxury of spare change. But if you do enjoy the show every couple of weeks, why not go to patreon.com/WW2podcast and become a patron of the show? Think of it like subscribing to a magazine, but rather than a piece of plastic tat you occasionally get taped to the front, I'll try and give you some audio extras from the chats I have, bits left on the cutting room floor. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Mark, thanks for joining me. I wonder, is our starting point to, I wondered if our starting point to talk about the events about Pearl Harbor, the lead up to Pearl Harbor, is actually sort of the idea of the US with its two ocean navy, and how they divide the forces, and how does that affect the balance of power in the Pacific pre-war? Because we do have the naval, Washington Agreement, the London Agreement. Is it London Agreements or is it London Agreement? I'm sure there's 3 naval agreements into war, isn't there?
Well, there's the Washington Naval Treaty and the first and second London Naval Treaties.
So how does that affect the US Navy and the balance of power in the Pacific pre-1939?
Well, pre-1939, the U.S. had not even built up to its allowed treaty limits. So it had a larger navy than the Japanese overall, but as you say, they had to cover 2 oceans with that. And then, of course, when the war began, and in 1941, the U.S. began this neutrality patrol in the Western Atlantic. And accordingly, they had to send a big chunk of the Pacific Fleet over to the Atlantic. And that included carrier Yorktown, 3 battleships, a number of light cruisers and heavy cruisers, I think 4 altogether, and 2 squadrons of destroyers. So when that happened, the U.S. was badly outnumbered by the Japanese in the Pacific. So right before Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had a numerical edge over the U.S. Navy, and that was especially true in aircraft carriers. There were only 3 U.S. carriers in the Pacific, and the Japanese had 10 of various sizes, 6 of which were large fleet carriers.
But in 1941, had we realised the importance that carriers were going to be? If we took the carriers out, I wondered, did the Americans think that perhaps their ships were more capable than the Japanese? If we looked at capabilities rather than just numerical superiority, or are they just still outgunned by the Japanese?
Oh, the U.S. Navy was very confident that ship for ship, man for man, plane for plane, that they were superior to the Japanese. They didn't really understand the capabilities of the Japanese Navy because, of course, they had no chance to observe it in action. The Japanese, though, were all over carriers, much more so than the U.S. Navy at this point. So as early as April 1941, they created what for the time was a very revolutionary thing. It was a carrier strike fleet called the First Air Fleet. They brought together into a single operational entity all 6 of their fleet carriers. And that's the force that carried out the Pearl Harbor attack. Without that kind of force, you simply can't do a Pearl Harbor type attack. So that was at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack the most powerful naval force anywhere in the world.
I'm guessing if you look at the 3 great navies in the world, the British, the Americans, and the Japanese, because they're the biggest of the treaty limit on the treaty limits, aren't they? Into our naval treaties. What made the Japanese take that slight sideways view and think carriers, the importance of carriers? Why had the British and the Americans missed the potential of carriers? Is there an arrogance of thinking, or I don't know, or is it just a tradition that had blinkered them, or why the Japanese sort of made this leap with carriers?
I don't think it's so much that the Americans and the British missed the potential of carriers. They were aware that, universally by all 3 of those large navies as the ultimate arbiter of naval power when it came down to a decisive battle. But all 3 navies still saw a big role for the carriers. And of course, the British had been using the carriers in an offensive way in the Mediterranean and off Norway, since the war began. So they were already doing this. But as you well know, their carrier force was small, and they had really inadequate aircraft operating off those carriers. But the American Navy was already thinking along the same lines of independent carrier strike groups even before the war started. But the Japanese, though, they had several air-minded officers, and they were able to convince Yamamoto, who we're all familiar with. He was the brains behind the Pearl Harbor attack. And so they had several air-minded zealots who were advocating to bring all the carriers together into a single strike force. And it wasn't until April 1941 that Yamamoto thought it was time to overcome the inertia there among all the bureaucracies within the Imperial Navy to do that. So the Americans were already thinking along those same lines, but I guess they weren't able to overcome any branch rivalry and actually combine the carriers and make the carriers the center of the Navy, which happened by default anyhow after the Pearl Harbor attack.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of the wake-up call, I think, for everyone to start thinking slightly different.
But it's also interesting to note that even after the Japanese Navy showed the vast potential of carrier air power, that the carriers weren't the central core element of the Imperial Navy. Well, until after the Solomons campaign. So, yes, they were, in fact, the principal offensive arm of the Navy, but they were still an adjunct to the battleship. In many ways. At Midway, for example, the Japanese brought all their battleships, 11 in total, to the fight, and they were intended to be the decisive force that would mop up the rest of the Pacific Fleet. So the Japanese, they really were acquainted with the offensive potential of carriers early on. They didn't really put it at the center of the Navy until later in the war.
That's interesting. So they're anticipating that carriers would take out the carriers, and so the battleships would steam in and mop up.
Pretty much. And Americans had the same concept too. Even late in the war, when they had the Fast Carrier Task Force, that's where the Americans put all their fast battleships. So at Leyte Gulf, for example, even Philippine Sea, there's a big carrier battle. They formed that independent fast battleship force that was ready to mop up any cripples that the carriers created.
Had the Americans ever planned for a war with Japan? How did they anticipate a naval campaign, an aggressive naval campaign from the Japanese?
Both sides really planned along the same lines before the war began in the 20s and 30s. And of course, the Japanese changed all this with their very daring attack in December 1941. But both sides generally saw the war developing along this manner. The Japanese would move to conquer the Philippines, and the American Navy would not be able to get there in time to rescue the garrison. The Japanese would conquer the Philippines, and then the Americans would mount this cross-Pacific attack to recapture the Philippines and block Japan and end the war by naval means. And so both sides envisioned a decisive battle somewhere in the Western Pacific. And that's what both sides trained for, both sides built their fleets for. And until Yamamoto came in 1939, that's what both sides were prepared to do. But he changed all of that.
So he comes in 1939. Why did he suddenly change? Because it's this idea of the big battle's always popular. You can pinpoint it through. Everyone wants a big battle because it's decisive and it's clean and it gives you a propaganda coup to move forward. So what's Yamamoto's thinking to move him away from that strategy? What's his background to make him think differently from this decisive battle somewhere in the Pacific?
Yeah, of course, the decisive battle concept was a favorite in IGN ideology since Tsushima. So in 1905, they had actually sought and achieved a decisive battle against the Russians, and literally that won the war against the Russians. So that would certainly work again the next war against the Americans. So that was a central core of their strategy throughout the war. Not in Pearl Harbor, they tried to get at Midway. They lost the opportunity at Guadalcanal, but then they tried again at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. So they continually sought and thought that this decisive battle would turn the tables in the Pacific. So that was the thinking behind this, and they called it in their parlance, trying to get the words right, great all-out battle strategy. That was the Japanese thinking behind this big set-piece battle in the Western Pacific. And that's when they would, with carriers playing a role, but the battleships would come in, in the final stage of the battle and mop up the U.S. Navy, and that would be it. But that was a much too passive strategy for Yamamoto. Even though the place of this great all-out battle did change from the Bonin Islands right off Japan, eventually it moved to the east there in the Marshall Islands, but even that was too passive for Yamamoto. And as we're all aware, Yamamoto, he was the single man responsible for the Pearl Harbor attack. There literally would not be a Pearl Harbor attack without him and his energy and his determination to make this happen. So his thinking was, and he having spent time in the U.S. As the naval attaché for part of his career, and also before then he was in the U.S. to study. So he thought he was quite familiar with the Americans. He understood the great potential of American industry and how it could clearly outbuild Japan if it came down to a war. But then he made the assumption that he could, in the first part of a war, that he could break American morale. So in order to do that, you really can't do that in this great all-out battle fought off some unknown island in the Marshall Islands. He was going to move the strategy out to the east, take it to Pearl Harbor, and cripple the American fleet at the onset of the war. And in so doing, this blow would be so powerful and so shattering, he would break American morale. So that's a very questionable assumption on his part. And people give him the credit for having this insight into the Americans, which as we'll see as we talk further about the attack, just should not, that's something he did not possess. So his thinking was that he had to deliver this shattering blow to the Americans at the onset of the battle to force them to negotiate on terms favorable to Japan, because even he realized that Japan could not fight a long, drawn-out war against the Americans.
Why Pearl Harbor? How important was Pearl Harbor to the U.S. Navy?
Even today, I suppose it is the principal base for the Pacific Fleet. So, in the middle of 1941, as Japan continued its aggression in the Far East and the U.S. began to ratchet up the economic pressure, Roosevelt kept the fleet at Pearl Harbor. It was based in California most of the year. It would go out to Pearl Harbor for an annual exercise, and then would come back to its base in California. But in 1941, I think it was May, he kept the fleet in Pearl Harbor, just to, for a little bit more pressure on the Japanese. So this gave Yamamoto the opportunity to strike the fleet as it lay in the harbor, and that being the only, the principal forward base, almost the entire fleet was based there.
I was actually thinking about Roosevelt racking up the pressure, partly the pressure that he's piling as well on Japan. I'm right in saying it is actually almost, I don't say egging Japan on, but when he's cutting off Japanese oil supplies, he's essentially pressurizing Yamamoto to attack as well, isn't he? When he's, I think,
not just Yamamoto, but the entire Japanese leadership. I mean, there was no serious debate about how to get out of their quandary. So when the U.S. cut off, and not just the U.S., but the U.K. and the Dutch as well, cut off a total trade embargo to include all the oil. And at that time, the Japanese got 90% of their oil from foreign sources, most of which came from the U.S. So when we cut that off, the Japanese were in quite a bind. And there was really no serious debate within the Japanese leadership how to get out of that vice. They were going to have to fight their way out. So, and this hogwash about Yamamoto being a man of peace and how he didn't want to attack the U.S. No, he was totally on board for Japan having to fight in this situation, and Japan attacking the U.S. if that's what it took.
And presumably then a sharp, decisive blow at Midway would breathe them either win the war or give them breathing space under the sanctions to carry on their campaigns elsewhere, presumably.
If you look at this Japanese thinking in depth, it is very ill-conceived. I mean, they had no real plan for war termination. And the plan loosely was, we'll attack the Americans. Oh, by the way, we'll continue to fight the Chinese and tie down most of the Imperial Army in China. And oh, yeah, just for good measure, we'll attack the UK as well and the Dutch. And we'll do it all at once. And also we'll await the first opportunity to attack the Russians, because that's what we really want to do if we're the Imperial Army. But to get out of their economic quandary, they had to acquire new resources. That means oil for the most part. And there was oil in the Dutch East Indies. So they did have to seize that to relieve the pressure. Now, was there any, and there was no power on earth except for the Americans and the American Navy that could possibly stop them from doing that. So that's the nominal reason for attacking the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor. But as we've already talked about, the U.S. Navy at this point was outnumbered by the Japanese quite severely, in fact, in aircraft carriers, which, as it turns out, that's the kind of war this is going to be. And oh, by the way, they don't have the logistics capability to mount a relief operation and attack towards the Philippines. You got to get through all the other Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. So that took us 2 years when we were infinitely stronger and able to support such a drive. So there's no way that the American Navy, even if left alone, would have been able to interfere with the Japanese invasion and seizure of the Dutch East Indies. So had they been thinking this a little bit more deeply and more thoughtfully, why even attack the Americans at all? It gets the Roosevelt administration out of their biggest problem, which is getting the Americans in the war in a united way, especially. Now, there was a little problem. I mean, the Americans did hold the Philippines, and that was astride their sea lines of communication between Japan and the newly conquered areas in the Dutch East Indies. But the American public probably was not going to fight for a Dutch colony, but they were obviously going to fight pretty hard if the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor.
When did they make the decision to make the attack? Before, and what point did they attack? How long did they have to put the plan together?
And that's another fascinating tale. I mean, this guy, and it does show the central role of Yamamoto. So he thought about this as early as March of 1940, he had discussed the idea of attacking Pearl Harbor. This was 1940, before there was the oil embargo and whatnot. So according to his chief of staff, it started in March. And after the war began, Yamamoto wrote a letter to a buddy of his saying that he decided to attack Pearl Harbor as early as December of 1940. So this man of peace thing doesn't quite hold up when you look at when he says, and there's no reason to not believe him in this case, that when he says he made his mind up. And also he made his mind up to do this, even though they didn't have the means to fuel the ships to get to Pearl Harbor and back. They didn't have any way to strike the ships there because their torpedoes wouldn't work in shallow water, and they didn't have bombs that were capable of hitting battleships and punch through their horizontal armor. And they had really no way to gain surprise. So he had made up his mind to do this, even though it was technically and operationally unfeasible to do so.
He's not the first one to dream up a mission that you then have to put together with special units and special weaponry.
Yeah, they did a good job, but once they made their mind up, they did attack all these problems, and they did do a good job, inventing solutions to all these major problems. But he was literally the only man, only principal leader in the Imperial Navy to want to do the operation. He began a dance with the Naval General Staff and the nominal superiors over Yamamoto in his capacity as the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. So in April 1941, he began to try to convince the Naval General Staff to do the operation to attack Pearl Harbor. And the Naval General Staff thought he was crazy, and so did everybody else, because it was just too risky. How are you going to approach the major American naval base 3,000 miles from Japan, gain surprise, and hit them hard enough to make it matter? And the Naval General Staff wanted to keep all the carriers at first to support that southern operation, to support the drive in the Dutch East Indies, because that's what they had to acquire early in the war. So it took him months and months of convincing to get the Naval General Staff on board. And how did he finally do that? It wasn't because his argument was so powerful. They kept saying the same thing, that we will not support the operation. It's too risky. We're not going to do it. But then in October, he threatened to resign. And that's how he got his way. He pulled the same stunt when it came to attacking Midway. But in both times, he got his way in the same manner. But it wasn't until, I want to say, I'm looking at the date here, 18 October is when he threatened to resign. And that's when he finally got the approval to mount the operation. And they're still fighting over the number of carriers. Yamamoto wanted to have all 6 fleet carriers in the operation, and the Naval General Staff didn't. They wanted to keep some back and support the southern operation. But in October, finally, he got his way, and he got all 6 carriers allocated to the attack.
When they're planning the attack, what are they aiming to knock out at Pearl Harbor as much as possible? Was there hierarchy of targets?
There's a definite hierarchy of targets, but there was a disconnect there between Yamamoto and his capacity as brainchild behind the operation and combined fleet commander, and the guys who were actually executing it, the first air fleet staff. So the first air fleet, because they are air-minded, they are the carrier warriors of the Imperial Navy, they put carriers at the top of the list. Yamamoto thought that this shattering blow had to cripple American naval might, and that meant sinking battleships. So both were high on the priority list. In fact, there were different priority lists according to the orders from the combined fleet and the first air fleet. But yes, carriers, battleships, then cruisers, and then lesser warships. But also, of course, they had to cripple American air power so there'd be no counterstrike on the Japanese fleet as they were flying sorties against Hawaii. But also, we should point out that there was never any thought by the Japanese that they were going to attack the naval base and the installations there at Pearl Harbor. That was the very last thing they were going to attack.
Who's in charge of the defense? Is it Kimmel in charge of the defense of Pearl Harbor, or is the defense of Pearl Harbor a navy or an army operation?
Well, the defense of the fleet was an Army operation, right? Because they were in charge of air defense. But there were problems too, because the head of the Army forces there, General Short, didn't quite get along with his air commander. So there was some friction between the head Army commander on the island and his air commander. But the Navy was responsible for doing surveillance around the island to detect any approaching threat. And that was Kimmel's job.
So the Navy's, is that the Navy's responsible for the air patrols surrounding the island
and the Army had the fighters and the anti-aircraft guns and the radars to defend the fleet. And there were certainly enough assets to do that. They had 6 radars on the island. There were 5 operational on the day of the attack. They had some 200 fighter aircraft, or 200 aircraft all told. And they had this embryonic air defense center set up there to orchestrate the defense. And in fact, in November, they had a highly scripted exercise where an American carrier launched an airstrike some 80 miles or so away from Oahu. And it was highly scripted, so they knew it was coming, but the Americans were able to detect the strike, get fighters up, and intercept them, before they reached their targets. So had the Americans been a bit more on their toes and ready to respond, it might have worked out quite differently.
Is it possible to lay blame on why the Japanese managed to slip in, or is it just a series of unfortunate events?
Yeah, it was a series of blunders by the Americans. I mean, the American Army and the American Navy simply were not battle ready. There was no conception that the Japanese had the capability to come 3,000 miles and deliver a major attack on the fleet at its primary base. There was no conception of that.
So I made a note. There's 87 US Navy vessels at Pearl Harbor on that morning of 7th December 41, and there's 8 out of 9 battleships, but the carriers are all out at sea. I mean, the Japanese must have wet themselves. It's a tremendous amount of vessels sat there. They've slipped through unnoticed, and they arrive. So how did the attack go?
Well, the attack was not tactically well executed. Like you said, there were 80 some warships of the fleet in Pearl Harbor on that morning, and the 3 carriers were not there. So the Americans did catch a tremendous break because all the carriers were gone. But there were 8 battleships there, a number of cruisers, 30 destroyers, 5 submarines. So the bulk of the fleet was in port. So the centerpiece of the Japanese attack was the first wave, and the first wave included the torpedo bombers because they're flying very low, very slow, so they're vulnerable. But if you gain surprise, then they can execute an attack against ships that are caught by surprise. And that's what they did. They were able to torpedo 4 battleships there along Battleship Row, anchored off Ford Island, 2 of which were hit heavily. So that's because the Japanese had a very dubious tactic of having most of the torpedo bombers come in from a single point in a line of stern. So they all came in at the same place, and right there in front of them were Oklahoma and West Virginia. So those 2 ships received most of the torpedoes. The Japanese over-concentrated on those 2 targets. They did put 2 torpedoes in California, 1 in Nevada, and they both eventually sank. But the attack, from that standpoint, was not well executed. And in fact, there were 16 torpedo bombers of the 40 that were assigned to attack the carriers. And even though the Japanese knew the day before and then on the morning of the attack from their spies on the island that there are no carriers present, they didn't have a backup plan. So these 16 torpedo bombers show up looking to hit the carriers there in their usual mooring spots, and they're not there. And they scramble around trying to find a different target to hit. And they end up hitting a bunch of secondary targets. Most of them do anyhow. So there was chaos from that standpoint. And then there was over concentration by the main body of the 24 aircraft that came in against Battleship Row directly.
What's the most? So they're bombing, dive bombing, and they're just bombing, regular bombing from altitude. Horizontal bombing, I guess. Is that horizontal? Is that what it's referred to as? What is the most?
Yeah, well, they call it level bombing. Yeah.
Level, but what is the most successful form of attack? One always thinks it's torpedoes or dive bombing. I'm not sure what was.
Oh, it was definitely torpedoes, because the dive bombers, and they were in the first wave, but they were assigned to hit the airfields in the first wave. So the second wave had all the dive bombers assigned to attack the naval targets. So the first wave was really the big heavy hitters. They were the level bombers carrying these specially converted 1,800-pound bombs that were able to penetrate battleship armor, because the small bombs on the dive bombers couldn't even penetrate battleship horizontal armor. So between the 40 torpedo bombers and the 49 level bombers carrying these big bombs, that was a Sunday punch intended to cripple the battleships. So the torpedoes did a good job. I mean, 40 torpedoes, the Japanese thought they were going to get 27 hits based on their planning and their assumptions and what they had done in practice. But in fact, only 19 hits. But they were still able, with those 19 hits, to take up the 2 battleships and cripple 2 more that did later sink. And the level bombers were somewhat ineffective. I mean, the 49 bombs dropped on that day, some 10 hit. And of those, 6 of them did not detonate or only had a low order detonation. But of course, that hides the most salient and iconic part of the attack, which was when one of these level bombers hit Arizona and penetrated the forward magazine, and the ship blew up, and 1,100 men were killed in an instant. So level bombers did achieve an outstanding success in that regard, obviously.
We always think of Pearl Harbor as an air-based attack, and you see the footage of planes sweeping around. Obviously, the film footage when they do Pearl Harbor films as the air attack. But there is 30. The Japanese include 30 submarines. Why do we not hear of the 30 submarines that take part in the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Well, because it was an utter failure, an utter and total failure. But you're right, that was a big part of the operation, and there were a lot of officers in the Imperial Navy who thought this air power thing is overrated. It's untested. We do not know how it's going to work out. So our backup plan is going to be, we're going to send out our 30 best submarines, fleet submarines, and they're going to operate off Hawaii and the channels to and from Oahu and pick off ships for the next couple of weeks. And then on top of that, we're going to get extra clever, and we're going to send in 5 midget subs into the harbor to attack targets there as well. Now, this is just foolhardy beyond belief. I mean, it has the potential to lose surprise the entire operation for very little payoff. And Yamamoto was convinced because the pilots of the midget subs and their commanders made an eloquent, emotional plea that they needed to be included in the operation. So at first, the plan was to have them sit off the harbor and wait for ships to come out of Pearl Harbor, and they would attack them then. But that wasn't glorious enough. So they begged to be included in the operation, and they changed their mind. Yamamoto did it, even though the aviators told him this is not a good idea. You may lose surprise here, and the whole jig may be exposed before we get a chance to attack our targets. That's okay. Yamamoto approved it. Then the 5 midget submarines proceeded before the attack up the channel to attack targets inside the harbor. And as we all know, one of these subs was detected at well before the attack. So the attack is about at 8 o'clock in the morning, just minutes before. Their first contact with the sub was at 03:42. So that's over 4 hours before the attack appears over the harbor. So had the Americans again been more battle ready, they could have certainly used 4 hours, to much better advantage. And the other subs, the 30 fleet subs, of which they weren't all off Pearl Harbor, but most of them were off Oahu somewhere. There were hundreds of ships coming and going in and out of Pearl Harbor and in Honolulu the next couple of weeks. There were only 3 merchant ships sunk in all that time. So it was a a total failure. And it was just the start of a very unequal war, or uneven war, let's put it that way, for the Japanese submarine force.
When the Japanese review their attack later on that day, what was their opinion? Had they considered it a success?
No doubt. It was an audacious operation that went very well. And of course, by the old standards of what's important to a Navy, they had crippled the Pacific Fleet's battle line. They had sunk a number of battleships. And of course, as aviators do, and not just Japanese aviators, but all aviators, overclaim on their successes. And they had claimed much more than, in fact, they had done. For example, the dive bombers, that second wave group that came in, and here are the elite Japanese dive bombers who are now tasked to hit stationary targets. So you would think they would do quite well at that. But it turns out, though, on this day, there was a heavy overcast over the harbor, and their attacks could not be done in their usual attack profile. So they couldn't conduct a full dive at a steep dive for maximum accuracy. So it achieved very little, but they still, of the 78 planes, I think they claimed 49 hits. In fact, there were just 15. But between the dive bombers, the level bombers, and the torpedo bombers, they claimed a much higher score than they actually achieved.
I've forgotten how many battleships did they knock out? They because the thing is, they do knock them out. They knock out a tremendous amount of shipping, but they ultimately don't knock it out because it all comes back into service, bar 2 ships, don't they? Is that?
Well, actually, 3 ships, because there was a mine layer that they sank as well, an ancient mine layer. So of the 8 battleships, 4 are sunk or are beached. In the case of the Nevada, 4 are out of operation. As you say, 2 never come back. The 2 that did come back, that having been sunk, came back in 1944. They were rebuilt. They came back into service. But it's also should be noted that with the ships that survived the attack on Pearl Harbor and came back within a few months of the attack, and then the Americans brought back their 3 battleships they had sent to the Atlantic. They brought them back in early 1942 in the Pacific. So by the time of Midway, there were 7 American battleships present. So they had rebuilt their battle line to a considerable degree. But Nimitz, who was in charge of the fleet after Pearl Harbor, in charge at Midway, he did not even want to use or risk those battleships at all. So that just showed the limited utility of those slow battleships in a modern carrier war. And in fact, they were useless to Nimitz at Midway.
How quick was the U.S. Navy to pick up the change on the emphasis after Pearl Harbor of the carrier rather than the battleship?
Oh, it was immediate, because of course there wasn't much else to work with. So, but when the Japanese had just shown that this was going to be a carrier war, that the battleship had been eclipsed by the carrier. And then of course, a few days after Pearl Harbor, the British take a hit off Malaya when they lose 2 capital ships to Japanese air power on the 10th of December. So at that point, it's pretty clear that battleships by themselves cannot operate in the face of a modern air threat. So the American Navy uses carriers right off the bat. They have a number of raids beginning in February, March, and April. In April, they bombed Tokyo with aircraft launched from a carrier. So right away, the carrier becomes the focus of American naval operations.
So if one of their goals was to provide the Japanese with breathing space, how much breathing space were they hoping to get? I mean, it doesn't sound like they really got any breathing space, really, which was one of their strategic goals for their raid.
They didn't need any breathing space because there was no threat posed by the Pacific Fleet. There was no way that the Pacific Fleet could have interfered with the conquest of the Dutch East Indies. So the Japanese had thought they were going to conquer the Dutch East Indies within 3 months. That went to schedule. So they didn't need a lot of space. Of course, there was a small American fleet in the Far East there, the Asiatic Fleet. And there's a small Dutch Navy present there, some Australian ships, and the Royal Navy was also there, but they were brushed aside by the Japanese quite easily. And the Japanese conquest of the Dutch East Indies went according to schedule. And by March, the Dutch had surrendered.
Yeah, they're absolutely annihilated, the Dutch, aren't they? The Dutch Navy.
The Dutch Navy did fight hard, and they were virtually annihilated. Yes.
So I'm not sure how much, if actually Pearl Harbor's not so much. I was going to say, I was going to use the word disaster, and actually, it's not. It's actually something that galvanizes Americans. It completely works in the opposite to what the Japanese want. You know, the idea of national humiliation actually galvanizes America and actually provides massive propaganda that the Japanese just never expected.
Right. And therefore it's the ultimate folly. I mean, it is truly the ultimate folly when you bring in a nation many times your own military potential into the fight with a will to destroy you. That's what Pearl Harbor did. So tactically, they didn't get much done. They sank a bunch of old battleships. Operationally, they did not cripple the Pacific Fleet. That was their main goal. And within just 5 months after Pearl Harbor, the crippled fleet, as you see in all these TV shows and other accounts of the attack, that crippled the American Pacific Fleet. Well, 5 months later, the crippled fleet stopped the Japanese cold at Coral Sea. And then 6 months later, after the Pearl Harbor attack, it crushed the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway. So operationally, the attack did not achieve its goals. And strategically, as you said, it was self-defeating. And another point should be made as well. Even if they had rolled into Pearl Harbor that day, had a flawless attack, and had sunk every single ship in Pearl Harbor, it wouldn't have mattered, because my favorite set of numbers is to talk about American naval production subsequent to Pearl Harbor. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, 18 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, 77 escort carriers, 8 battleships, 13 heavy cruisers, 33 light cruisers, 349 destroyers, 203 submarines. So what did the attack ultimately achieve, the Japanese? Almost nothing. And it was to their ultimate detriment.
I read somewhere, I'm not sure if this is apocryphal, that when King was told that, almost given a blank check to build ships, that he was eventually, they were trying to persuade him not to because they were running out of sailors to put on the ships that he was cranking out. They were coming out at such speed.
Yeah, that was the bigger problem than trying to build ships. You're right, trying to man the fleet. So they had a lot of problems with that, but they did get it done, and they were trained to a high standard. Unlike the Japanese, who couldn't replace their losses really at all, nor maintain the Japanese fleet at the start of the war, ship for ship, was the best navy in the world. They need to be given all credit for that. I mean, highly trained, highly proficient navy. The naval air arm was the best, and ship for ship, they were superior to the Americans, but they couldn't maintain that superiority, on a qualitative level throughout the war. And the Americans, got better and better as the war went on.
Well, that seems like a good place to finish. Mark, thank you. It was good. It was good to catch up with you once more, folks. If you want to know more about the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, Mark's new books are The United States Navy in World War II, From Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, and Pacific Carrier War, Carrier Combat from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa. As ever, I will put links on the website. Well, I think that's all from me for now. Fingers crossed, next time out we'll be looking at General George S. Patton. Until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.